I had a pigeon come on my train for one stop.
Yeah, and it hops
Yeah,
off.
it was great. Yeah.
They know what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're the best navigators in the animal kingdom.
We're the Ground Hags, and this is our coffee reading podcast where we talk to artists about what they do on the daily and also their deepest, darkest secrets.
We're archiving the collective unconscious through our own bastardized version of the ancient art of coffee ground fortune-telling.
This podcast focuses on some interviews that we did with artists, but do not be fooled. It's part of the Ground Hags multiverse, aka our archive, which also includes plenty of strangers who we met in bars and festivals,
Donut shops,
at the airport,
at the courthouse.
You name it. You can find it on our website via the link in this episode's description, or you can just come to our next gig to find out what's brewing on your mind.
We dare you.
Ground Hags.
Before we get started, basically just a little tiny disclaimer. Lydia was ill for the entirety of this episode when it was recorded and is also sick again today. So I am here to stand in for her, basically. No worries.
I think, if I may, Lydia just wants to say to you guys that she accidentally got stuck in an English accent for the entirety of this interview somehow, which I wish I could say was the first time.
Guys, I'm so sorry. It's a bad habit. Anyway, to apologize because I am sincerely sorry. I will be going Valley Girl for the rest of this episode.
Uh-oh.
Speaking of apologies, do you know who actually deserves a freaking apology?
The pigeon.
The pigeon, guys. It's the pigeon.
The pigeon. Excellent transition, because this episode we spoke to James Powell and Eliot Haworth. James is part of an architectural collective which is called Feral Partnerships, and they ask this really interesting question of what it means to design for a city that's inhabited by more than just humans. Eliot is a writer and a researcher who specializes on design, culture, and ecology, and he collaborated with Feral Partnerships on an exhibition called Dovetails, which, you guessed it, is on human-pigeon relationships. I actually had the pleasure to see it on at Lot Projects in 2023, which is how all of this kind of started. Their collaboration on the exhibition, they told us, stemmed from a mutual fascination with the pigeon, which is something that Lydia and I for sure noticed, and maybe all of you listeners also noticed, was kind of a trend across both pop culture and politics in the past couple of years. You might have seen the J.W. Anderson pigeon clutch or Lord's Hammer music video, for example. And at the same time, in the realm of politics, pigeons have become a symbol for the underdog across many different forms of marginalization, I would say, namely class, race, disability, and queerness. Zoran Mondani's campaign merch, some of you might have seen, heavily featured the pigeon. And here in Germany, the left-wing party's Heidi Reicheneck recently drew a comparison between the bird and working class oppression. So we asked ourselves, what makes the pigeon such a powerful allegory for the disenfranchised?
We did ask ourselves, and quick crash course for those of you who are unfamiliar with the history of the pigeon. The pigeon was the first ever domesticated bird, and we lived side by side with them for thousands of years. We ate their meat and eggs, and used their guano, aka their shit, for fertilizer, and their wings for communication. They're the species awarded the third highest number of military decorations after humans and dogs.
Wow.
They're religious symbols for fertility, loyalty, and peace, often associated with deities like Ishtar, Aphrodite, and the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
They coexist with humans exceptionally well, amongst other things, because human architecture mimics their ancestors' cliff faces. And we've trained them to compulsively breed to get the most out of them because they were so useful to us for so long, but now that we've replaced them by chickens, chemical fertilizer, and, well, email, suddenly, they've become a nuisance, abandoned by us on the city streets. Now they live somewhere between domestic and wild. They are too much nature for culture, and too much culture for nature.
Yeah, and if that sounds dramatic to you, listen to this. Feeding a pigeon on Trafalgar Square can cost you £500. It was criminalized in 2003 by the Mayor of London to create a, quote, more pleasant environment. This forced removal of pigeons from public spaces follows in the tradition of New York City's Park Commissioner Hoving, the first ever person to refer to a pigeon as a rat with wings, when he called for a ridding of Bryant Park from, and I'm quoting here, homosexuals, winos, and pigeons, our most persistent vandal.
Boo!
Boo! Boo Hoving. Around that same time, the story of pigeons as disease carriers became widespread. Experts largely agree, by the way, that the risk to humans of a pigeon is actually no more than a house cat. In many ways, we find that this kind of mirrors a general trend towards cleansing urban space, and the parallels between anti-pigeon spikes and so-called hostile architecture, which is like anti-homeless architecture in public spaces like train stations, is a really glaring example of that. All of this reveals what I would consider quite an insidious relationship between power and aesthetics, in terms of who gets to control the space. And that is actually the central question of this episode. We spoke to Eliot and James about what a cityscape might look like if urban design took into account more than just its human inhabitants, thinking about what birds, what weeds, what bacteria reside there. What does it truly mean to see our cityscape as inhabited and cohabited by different species? There are a ton of really interesting projects that explore these questions happening right now. And Lydia actually has a little anecdote about one of those.
I do. I went on a little side quest and I ended up representing the carnivorous waxy glass snail in a form of parliament. There's basically like a fenced-in patch of urban wilderness in Berlin called the Organisms Democracy, where a collective has identified all the more than 400 species of residents that live there and decreed them all active citizens as much as humans. They've set up a constitutional government that politically represents all of these citizens, including, but not limited to, no, I'll stop, mollusks and worms, tree shrubs and climbers, fungi and mosses, and even the coronavirus. Which is kind of crazy,
Yeah.
But think about it. Their constitution determines that all residents have equal rights, even a virus that might be harmful to others. Now, that notion may seem like super radical, but it poses a question that's at the heart of this interview. How are our notions of care and utility tied up in each other? Is it possible to decouple them? And in the context of James and Eliot's work, what might a feral notion of care and design look like?
We hope that you're just as inspired by this interview as we were, because actually after talking to Eliot and James, we both kind of went on our separate little pigeon adventures. So Lydia ended up volunteering at a pigeon protection organization, and I ended up doing an illustration reportage on pigeon de-stringing for my master's. But those are stories for another day, as they say.
Indeed.
Thank you to Eliot and James for speaking to us, and all of you listeners. We hope that their words also inspire you to have some pigeon adventures of your own.
Thanks for having us around. It's a pleasure. My name is James Powell. I'm a member of the collective Feral Partnerships. I'm also an architect and researcher based in London. And Feral Partnerships is a collective of 4 of us. It also includes Enrico Brondelli di Brondello, Bess Fisher-Levine, and Matthew Dharma Paul. And it really came about when we were studying back at RCA in 2019. And we were all doing projects, but also kind of thinking and feeling and caring more widely around the climate crisis, around the biodiversity crisis in particular, and the kind of challenges that other species were facing in this period of time that we're calling the Anthropocene, where, we have incredible extinctions at incredible rates. And that's all kind of, as we know, linked to human activity. So we founded this collective as a way of kind of dealing with that frustration that we all had, that we were part of this machine that was doing incredible damage to other species. Researching the kind of architectures that could help other species to flourish, that could include them in the kinds of ways that we're making space.
Hi, my name's Eliot Haworth. I'm also from London. I'm a writer, editor, and researcher with a research focus on non-human life and the built environment. And that kind of stems from a academic background in zoology.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us today. It's really great to meet you in person and to speak to you. I think where I would love to start is with this word feral. It's such an interesting word to me because it has a quality that's different from, say, wild. Something maybe a bit more transgressive, a bit more dangerous. So I'm interested in, I guess the thought process behind picking the name Feral Partnerships.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It is transgressive. I remember when I worked in architectural practice, if anything was kind of looking a bit rubbish or not working, but that's looking a bit feral or something. So it has this definitely like it's not quite how it should be, but we really enjoy that that use of that word. I mean, I guess I personally first came across it in that sense was, I think, a book we probably all know, George Monbiot's Feral. It was this book about rewilding, and I guess for many people, but definitely for me, it was a kind of introduction to rewilding philosophy. Even though I think in a way there was a lot of it that was about a kind of quite privileged but well-meaning man entering into nature and experiencing this kind of rawness, this feralness in that sense. I guess in a way we've sort of moved away from, we're more interested in maybe forms of cohabitation and kind of the everyday and the mundane forms of coexistence. And I guess we have that other word, partnerships, which kind of speaks to that. It's the idea that it's always this coexistence and this contingency.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You bring up the second half of the phrase, partnerships. And I guess right now a lot of us are sort of grappling in the wake of the climate crisis with this idea of what does it mean to kind of cohabitate with other forms of life. And I do think that a big chunk of that is sort of this apocalyptic, not fantasy, but yeah, this apocalyptic vision of, I guess, like a return to other forms of living in nature through a breakdown in infrastructure. But that also kind of causes a lot of people to dip their toes into these questions through things like rewilding projects in urban space. And I'm really interested in your perspective, I guess, on what does it mean to think about cohabitation with other forms of life in the 21st century? What does a city look like that takes those questions into account?
A lot of my own work and thinking and writing is tied together by a fundamental belief that cohabitation, not just within urban space, but kind of just cohabitation in general, is a non-negotiable fact and not a thing that can be brought into existence or opted in or out of. It sounds kind of simple, but it's really been very helpful as a way of, just as a starting point, to help reframe how we think of spaces, particularly cities, because we quite often slip into ideas of cities being separate from other forms of life or other spaces, things that need to be rewilded, as though they had no connection to anything else. So I think I'm quite interested in looking at language and slippages and how those shape how we think about things.
I mean, firstly, I totally agree with the fact that cohabitation is a non-negotiable, and I guess what's changed maybe with the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis is the kind of recognition that actually not considering that is a problem and it's causing lots of problems, that lack of consideration. So it's for me it's about reframing the act of making architecture as the act of making habitat. And once you start from that, and you start from the fact that you have a range of stakeholders, if you like, in your design, it raises all sorts of questions, which are then very difficult to answer. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, I was gonna say, break that down for someone with no architectural background like me. Taking stakeholders into account, it just means like, how would I design the space if I'm taking into consideration maybe the birds that live there, or what the mold that grows in the walls needs, or... Yeah.
I mean, if we're going, I guess, down into the kind of mundane mechanics of how that happens, I suppose those, in a way, they already exist. There's this kind of process of doing a building survey or site survey where you recognize what lives there. And that could be a starting place to say, these are residents here, if you like, and they have a right. You could kind of, if you wanted to, enshrine rights for those residents to remain there. And then how do you kind of work around it, introducing your interest? And then, it's all about investigating what that interest is. It's generally a kind of capitalistic interest about generating value from a site. So then you're going into analyzing a kind of extractive process. And what's your relationship to that as an architect? That's, I think, where I got quite stuck when I was in practice, where I realized I really can't challenge this extractive model, which is what you need to do if you're going to really talk about a kind of multi-species democracy.
it raises so many interesting questions, because I think non-human life, when considered particularly through architecture as a practice, as an industry, is inherently awkward. It's just really awkward. It's like, how do you factor them in as a client? How do you maximize units in a building if you have to actually take into account the things that live there and really like bend things to suit other beings that have like no interest in what you want in your apartment block or what you need? It's just this idea of like taking into account needs of things, and the needs of other species can be like so wildly different from our own that actually taking them seriously can be really challenging and weird. And inherently, I think actually giving space to things to survive and live and thrive a lot of the time does lead you into the realm of having to take an anti-capitalist stance. Most of that, if you do it really seriously and keep following and unpicking those threads, it's quite hard to not get back to a place where you see that forms of capitalism, capitalist extraction do become harmful for the things that you are vouching for. And so having to remove yourself from those systems becomes an aim. And
I just think it's a really interesting idea to kind of reframe cohabitation as something that you do actively rather than just passively. And I'm kind of really interested how this word like multi-species democracy, like how, I guess, beyond the just architectural design of the buildings, how that's also tied to just, I guess, everyday practices of making a home, I guess, in terms of care. And kind of, I think Feral Partnerships, you guys wrote this really interesting essay about the animal house, which we briefly had a look at. And just this idea that, I guess, practices of care are often like confined to the space of the self that's separated from the outside, and kind of having to reframe what is like inside and part of this care that you extend to. So yeah, kind of just care as like an active practice and cohabiting as well, instead of just like in the passive design, although that also makes some massive difference, as you guys have been explaining.
Yeah, I mean, totally agree. There's a kind of seminal definition of care by the feminist theorists Berenice and Tronto. If that's right.
Is it Berenice Fisher and
Joan
Tronto?
And
Joan Tronto.
And they kind of describe care as this they call it this kind of species of activity, which is about essentially just like maintaining your world, kind of everything that you do to maintain, and also fundamentally a shared world. So it's kind of caring with, like, who are you caring with? Who's included in that process? Caring about, which is a kind of more familiar definition. And then obviously caring for, which is the kind of more literal act. I find the idea of caring with quite interesting, like who we kind of form care attachments about. Things like, nation might be kind of dominant today. Care for country, care about maybe your kin. And this is, you could refer to kind of Donna Haraway and like, how do you investigate that idea of kin and who's included in your act of caring? Which is, it brings up something interesting about the kind of exclusiveness of care often, and the exclusiveness of empathy. This is again something that you can talk a long time about, but like, where are the boundaries of that kind of care, and how can you kind of remain aware of those boundaries, and what are you othering, and how do you keep kind of combating that?
I came across your work at the Dovetails exhibition that you held at Lot Projects, which focused on the many different roles that the pigeon has historically taken on or played. And to me, what I left that exhibition thinking about really was the question of the relationship between care and usefulness, and whether care is something that's given freely and universally, or whether care is always contingent on getting something back in return. And I think that the pigeon is such a fascinating case study for this, because obviously pigeons used to be so useful, so kind of important to us historically. And it seems to me that it's no coincidence that when they kind of lost that value to us, they really had this this plummet in reputation. So, now we see them as pest animals that are kind of gross, kind of disgusting. We have this phrase, rat with wings. And yeah, I'm curious about that. Do you think it's related to the fact that we no longer use their what is it called?
The guano.
Yeah, the guano.
And a food source as well.
Yeah, and as a food source.
Mm-hmm.
I think retracting care for something that is no longer deemed useful is like clearly not care or caring. It's become a very trendy term at the moment. It's therefore ripe for misuse. It's also suffering from attack. I feel sometimes the need to stick up for care because I think it's so easy to deride it sometimes, because it can sound a bit airy fairy and vague. But I think it's actually it's super, super important and really hard to, if you boil down to its fundamentals, it's really hard to argue against it. It's just that it can be used in ways that are a bit imprecise and damaging to it. Yeah.
I mean, I guess historically there's been this campaign against care, right? Almost, which is well established in feminist literature, for example. The devaluation of caring practices and how they essentially become, like historically, have been an incredibly strong barrier against extraction. Basically, like this idea that care is doing some work that isn't valued is incredibly important when we talk about the climate, because when you get to this, when you take this space where care is being done in some way and you replace it with a kind of in some way mechanized system, these kinds of forms of carelessness like appear in the forms of like chemical pollution or in terms of climate disruption or in terms of species loss. That all of those kinds of work were being done without the modern terminologies around species loss and biodiversity and climate, but they were being done. So now we're kind of trying to reclaim them with all of these, we've got the idea like, hey, that was doing work on a global scale, that kind of care that seems really innocuous and mundane and boring.
I think it's very naughty as well, isn't it? It's quite a complicated relationship. Like, where do you draw the line between caring for something and using something when there's so many different vested interests? I know that in your text for Dovetails, you wrote at length about pigeon fanciers and how complicated that kind of relationship is. And you had a sentence, a bird in hand might be seen as a gesture of care or of control, which I thought was really beautiful. Because it's true that trying to untangle those two things from each other is not always easy.
No. Yeah, should we talk about the exhibition? So I took us on like a big tangent. But yeah, I think that the whole impetus for the exhibition and why we were looking at pigeons, I think ties into a lot of the things we've been talking about already, and the fact that they are super complicated species. They have these incredibly entangled histories with human beings, and are species that have gone through different waves of popularity or care or being cared for or being deemed as useful or not useful. Dovetails was an exhibition that we did in October of last year. It was instigated by Rosie Ballam from Lot Projects, and she asked Feral and myself to do an exhibition kind of on animal life in some form, and we kind of quickly came on or settled on the topic of pigeons, which overlapped with a lot of research that we'd all been doing independently. I'd been doing a commission for the Architecture Foundation, which is a sort of long-running audio essay research project on animals and cities. And so there's a lot of that was about pigeons. I'd spent a lot of time interviewing pigeon fanciers, talking to geographers and philosophers about the place the pigeons have or given or denied in cities. So I was very interested in them. And James had been doing some research into pigeons too, which maybe you want to tell us concisely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I came from a slightly more well, it's more architectural and maybe more sort of intentional or infrastructural approach about how we might design with pigeons in mind and what that might do, which came out of a residency I did at the Design Museum in 2023, where I was interested in the typology of dovecotes or house for pigeons and what that had been used for historically, kind of as this both gesture of kind of creating a shelter for pigeons, but also the way that was then used to gather their shit, their guano, and that was used for agriculture. It was used for making kind of tanning leather and for making gunpowder even. So in the Napoleonic Wars, they actually put like guards outside these, like, because they became incredibly valuable because they were part of the war machine, and you used to have to give like a ration of guano to the army, things like this. So basically, what I'm saying is it was this incredibly useful typology that has been almost entirely forgotten since chemical fertilizers were invented. And I was interested in how that kind of human-pigeon relationship spoke about, many other things within that. Kind of in the same way that pigeons, their kind of historic closeness to people reveals a lot about people as well as a lot about pigeons. So I think that's what kind of united the show, was that interest in the close relationship of the pigeon and the human. And we provided some kind of drawings on this proposal that I did for the Design Museum, and Eliot had these really, maybe you want to speak about them more, but it's incredible images that you collected of pigeon fanciers.
I came in more from because a lot of my background's in making printed matter, and I sort of obsessively collect books and magazines, and I got really interested in these yearbooks for pigeon fanciers called Squills, which is this like incredibly long running magazine that I'd never heard of, but it's been going since the 30s. It's been going since before Vogue magazine, which is nuts. And they release them every year, and it's a sort of annual yearbook for the pigeon fancy world, and it's got everything you might want to know as a pigeon fancier. And they still produce them, they're still bought, there's still a market for them. So I got really interested in those as a way into exploring this particular type of human pigeon relation, which is that of the pigeon fancier. I sort of accumulated this archive of Squills magazines from somewhere between like the 1950s to today. So sort of like decades of pigeon obsession put into print form, and I was picking out like imagery of dovecotes, imagery of men, usually men, holding their prize pigeons. I got really interested in the language, so I made lots of lists. I had a huge roll call of like 100 champion pigeons that I hung from the wall. I got really carried away, basically, but it was a way into exploring this super fascinating world and tradition.
I love it. I guess as a last kind of question, what can we learn from all this? What might other forms of multi-species collaboration look like?
Well, there's lots of examples, I suppose, of multi-species art, and your mind immediately goes to, elephants performing. I think it raises all the questions we've talked about today around care and control. I mean, the latest project I've done has been on, the one I was doing in Berlin actually was on a residency for 3 months, with Spray Park Art Space, which is this kind of is by this abandoned amusement park that's now being redeveloped into an art and cultural park. And one of the questions there is how they integrate what had been this very wild, overgrown site where lots of endangered species had come to live into this kind of art park. But in particular, we were focusing on animal architecture, and kind of as part of that, animal artists and animal kind of creatives, and what kind of the kinds of creative and material practices that they use in their kind of, if you're a scientist, you say behavior, but we'd like to say something maybe more provocative and say kind of animal cultures of making and building. And they're incredibly broad. And like, who invented sculpture, for example, or who invented carving? And you can sort of posit the woodpecker and the pecking of the kind of carving out of the tree as a form of a home, but also as a kind of incredible form. Similarly with the potter wasps or the clay wasps that make these really sculptural, like clay sculptures, clay forms. It's human, a kind of human perspective. Is it art or not? But in terms of the material techniques, humans didn't invent any of these. They kind of come from animal antecedents. And I think that's maybe a nice way to think about inheritance. And
Eliot, any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not someone I'm more of a looker or an observer than an active collaborator in that way. It makes me think of an essay by the Belgian philosopher Vinciane Despret in her book essay collection. What would a whale say if asked the right question? I think that's the name of the book. Or what would animals say if asked the right question? And it's an kind of ABCD of different essays she's written over the years. And there's one on elephant painting, which is great. And I'm going to do a terrible job of paraphrasing it. But what's interesting is that she flips the tables on maybe an overly simplistic reading of an elephant's painting as a form of potential exploitation or commercialization, or the tourism industry using them to like create artworks to sell or bring in more tourists or whatever, and tries to encourage you as a reader and or thinker to consider what questions within this, how are we thinking within any critiques here of the potential for elephants to experience joy or creative impulse, or to actively want to produce these things, and to not dismiss or speak for them as things that are incapable of enjoying these things or having any active role in it. So I also think that's an important counterpoint to an understandable maybe hesitance or uncertainty around active collaboration with non-human life, because it's complicated. It's just complicated.
Well, I think that's a great note to end it on.
Stay with the trouble.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of the issues we're talking about are present in relationships that humans have with each other. And maybe it's complicated because it's more difficult to communicate, and you have to have a kind of intermediary representative that's somehow always going to be artificial within human structures in some way. I guess you could generalize and say that was present in in animist cultures, that did the work of kind of representing them in the ways they managed and lived on the land. That's been thoroughly kind of destroyed by a combination of monotheistic religions and modern science, but maybe not postmodern science. It's kind of going back in that direction, which is what's exciting. Yeah, I guess art becomes a space to explore these things without having to come up with what's the answer here, what's the solution.
Yeah.
Time for the coffee report.
Interesting. Okay. So they're not I don't think we let them completely dry. So I think we might have slightly sabotaged the reading, because there's fewer shapes than usual in the cup. But in the first cup, I'm getting a whiff of sea. These is very nature-based imagery. But James, your cup, if I'm correct, if that was the first one, there's some interesting shapes. I see manatee. Yeah, there's a manatee swimming towards one side, and then underneath it there is this creature that I forgot the name of, but it's like electric blue, and it has these these black stripes on it, and it looks like a little dragon, but it's quite small. Oh wait, it's actually called a blue dragon. Sorry. And then on the bottom we have two kind of starfish / I love that it's like the shape could double as like a human laying there gazing, or it could be a starfish. It's kind of this ambiguity that's also really interesting and that the cup plays with. On the other side, that's like a shepherd to me. So there's like it's kind of cut off by like the coffee ground. So there's a floating head, kind of like what I have been today, and then like part of the body, and then he's like marching along with something that we can't quite make out, but it's that kind of image, and I think it's just a very exploratory nature. So this is the imagery of the first cup, and then the second cup is a bit more precise.
Oh, it's my one.
Which is also interesting. Yes, that's your one.
I guess you could say Eliot is more precise.
No.
Well, slightly. It's more traditional, like cup-wise, because usually these cups also build like a story. So it's very like fantastical creatures that then somehow weave together like a story. And we can try and bring these together after we've deciphered them. Basically, it's like code. But the second cup, there's I might start with the big figure. There's I basically see a lady in a dress, and it's kind of the figure that's holding the weight of the kind of coffee lump. It's holding the weight of the big coffee lump on one shoulder, and it's almost like molded into her body. So she's like, her body is like shaped by this big weight that she's holding, and the dress is kind of not deteriorating, but like made out of these worm-like creatures that are like slithering away. It very much feels as if it was like a multi-species dress, if we think about it, like a dress that was alive, rather than one that was static, like made by live creatures, which is interesting.
Do you think she's weighed down by the lump, or she's flying?
Ooh, sorry, what was that? So she could be flying.
Do you think she's weighed down by the big lump of coffee, or do you think she's sort of flying through the air? Because she's horizontal, it makes me see some sort of like flying movement and this sort of trailing dress. At least that's my own
both.
wishful reading.
I see the broomstick as well.
Witchy,
I think it's really interesting. I also see both, and I think that's kind of what the cup is also calling attention to. It's this like ambiguity between floating and like being in the ether and flying, but also being able to be weighed down by something. And yeah, there's also like a big difference between the light and the dark. I don't know if this like, I guess, state of being resonates at all, because it's very interesting that it draws like attention to the immaterial, because it's like the dress is like trailing off and it's like alive by itself, and it's almost like you're like melding into the ether, but at the same time there's like this weight, this very solid weight on your shoulder. I guess it's, to me, it's like calling for a new opportunity, like something that is remaking you from the ground. Like there's even though you're flying, there's this weight that's really changing.
I could be flying through the earth.
Sorry?
I could be flying through the soil like a worm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, seeing the, like, I guess, soil as a form of universe, because it's very much like floating in space, but it's also very much like in the soil, and it's the worms that are building the dress. Yeah, so it's like it's a shift in identity. I feel like that this cup is talking about, caused by this weight, but I don't think that's necessarily negative. It's just very transformative. It's like a very transformative potential. Great. Yeah, she's like the main symbol, but then one of my favorites is right on the other side. I see a little cat with a shovel. It's like right on the edge of the right on the edge of the cup. But again, very, very like transformative. It's building something, it's scourging, it has a project going on. Yeah, so this one is very transformative, I would say, this cup.
That's inspiring.
Whereas the first one is much more just like exploration as a state of being. It's less transformative. It's very much like it's a very inquisitive cup. I feel like it gives the energy of just as if you were like laying on the bottom of the ocean and like looking up and just like observing and taking in. So it almost feels as if, I guess, the rest of the world is you're like in an aquarium and you're seeing the rest of the world like through the glass almost, and observing it. There's like that energy to it, which I think is the main difference between these two cups. And the first one is that's a very wondrous energy. Instead of transformative, it's more kind of contemplating.
It was quite nested. Layers within it.
There's always so many layers. I feel like that these.
The bottom of the sea, you can see the shallows and the kind of depths.
Yes, you can see like the specific like refractions of the light as well of the sea. I hope you guys can see like the different environments that these cups, because the first one was very much like soil universe and the other one is very much like the sea.
Yours has got,
which is really interesting.
I can't believe how detailed the lady's face is on that one. It's crazy to really see her. She's also got a unicorn horn. Yeah.
It's very multi-species of her.
Oh, she does! Or a witch hat.
Or a witch hat.
Yeah, I maintain that she's a witch.
Or she's a narwhal.